Viewers who are watching on YouTube can see that we have in front of us a rather intriguing looking model. And it's actually a tourbillon movement, but it's been enlarged 1,000 times. Is that correct? Hence its name.
Yep.
This is a print. This was printed. This is a 3D printed mechanism. Hello, and welcome to the Collectability Podcast. My name is Tania Edwards, and I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Nicholas Manousos, who is an expert watchmaker and Executive Director of the Horological Society of New York.
Thank you, Tania.
You're very welcome. This is part one of a two-part conversation. And today we will learn about Nick's journey from Silicon Valley to making silicon parts for watches. And in part two, we will learn about his role as Executive Director of the Horological Society of New York and how he has successfully revitalized this 150-year-old non-profit organization, which is one of the oldest continually operating horological associations in the world. But first, a brief biography.
Okay, all right.
So, Nick, you grew up on the West Coast of the United States and started your career as a software engineer in your hometown of Silicon Valley. After a few years, you're using your engineering mindset, you started to become interested in the world of watchmaking. And fortunately, your wife picked up on this interest and encouraged you to attend watchmaking school. And so Nick and his wife moved across the country so that Nick could enroll in WASTEP, which stands for the Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Educational Program, which is affiliated with the Nicholas G. Hayek Watchmaking School in Miami. Now, after that, you then moved to New York, where you immersed yourself in the local watchmaking community and soon became the technical editor for Hodinkee. With your focus on the technical aspect of watchmaking, you began to experiment with 3D printing watchmaking projects. And actually, we will come to this very intriguing piece on the table later on when we talk more about 3D printing for watchmaking. And you also became involved with silicon manufacturing of watch parts, which will be very interesting to learn about later. You are a board member of the Watch Library Foundation and a member of the Academy at the Grand Prix d'Horologie de Genève. Nick lives in New York with your wife and young son. Welcome, Nick. You grew up in Silicon Valley during the digital revolution, and your father worked in the tech industry. So it's not surprising that you also ended up as an engineer in the technical industry. Can you tell us about your early life and what your career as a software engineer was like during the very pioneering time of the 1990s?
Yeah, I remember clearly the when my dad brought home the first Macintosh, and it was a big deal. It's kind of funny because this week is, I think, the 40th anniversary of the Macintosh launch. I think that's right.
Wow.
And that's why they're timing it with the Apple Vision Pro. So yeah, 40 years ago, and I was, I think, I was almost four and a half years old. And I remember the first Macintosh, and my dad brought it home, and it was this super high-tech thing. And just growing up in Silicon Valley, and visiting San Francisco, being in San Jose, seeing all the big tech companies there, it was just, it's just kind of what you do when you live there.
Right.
It's kind of different than New York, where New York is very diverse in terms of the people and in terms of the industries here. There's lots of different industries in New York. But in Silicon Valley, I mean, it's called Silicon Valley for a reason. It's primarily the tech industry. So my dad worked in the tech industry, and I grew up thinking, I like computers. I like working with kind of, like you mentioned, an engineering mindset. And I went to school. I majored in computer science, and I got a job working as a programmer, and kind of worked my way up, and did did the whole roundabout in the tech industry in Silicon Valley for a long time. It was good. It was bad. It was exciting. It was frustrating. It was kind of like everything at once.
Right. But you learned a lot from that time, obviously.
Yeah.
And I am I right in understanding? Well, you have an interest in electronic music, but is it true that you started your own record company?
Yep. Yeah, it's very true. And just recently, I because I was in the basement trying to find this model for the Tourbillon, and I found my old box of records from when I was DJing. So I brought those out, and I don't think I've had a turntable for years, but I went out and I bought just a regular turntable to hook it up. But yeah, back when I was in college at UC Santa Cruz, I was really interested and into electronic music, dance music, and I started a record label. And it was back in the 90s when the rave scene was really big here in the U.S. and I guess in California. And I just got swept away in it. I didn't do much studying. The focus of my time in school was running a record label and DJing all over the place and flying all over the country. So I did not do very well in school, but I ran this record label. We produced 12-inch vinyl records. Sold them around the world. The name of the record label was Argon Records, Argon like the element.
I love the fact that you did that. That's a very diverse background for a watchmaker. But how did you decide to become a watchmaker? What was it that changed your mind or really enticed you into the industry?
Well, it was who changed my mind.
Who changed your mind?
My
okay.
wife. Yeah, my wife. So we got married in 2010. And when you get married, it's a big life event, and you start thinking about life in general, right? And it's an emotional time. And I remember, talking with my wife before we got married and telling her, "Hey, I just got to tell you, got to be honest with you. I don't love working as a programmer here in San Francisco. It's not something I want to always do, and maybe we're not always going to stay here in San Francisco." She was the first person I'd ever really told about that, because up until then, it was like 10 or 15 years that engineering, working as a programmer was my life. And she encouraged me. She said, you got to do what you want to do what you love, do what excites you. And she said that she knows that I love mechanical watches, and she encouraged me to look into that further and pursue it. And I did. And I discovered that watchmakers were very much in demand here in the U.S., and that watchmaking school was, for the most part, free in the U.S. And all of a sudden, it seemed like, oh, this is something that I could actually do. But beforehand, it seemed like watchmaking, I had the stereotypical view of it. I thought, okay, this is something that is only really done in Switzerland. It's kind of a dying art. It's not here in the U.S.
And it's wizard old men, curved,
up in
curved
the mountains,
over
the snowy mountains.
Yes, a bench. Yes, with cows, cowbells click in the back.
Which absolutely does happen, but that's not all of it.
Right.
It's a worldwide industry, and I just started Googling and researching and finding, wow, there's schools across the U.S. I had no idea about the American watchmaking industry. And I thought, hey, this could be something exciting and fun to do. And Dika encouraged me. My wife's name is Dika. And she said to go for it. And I applied to a few different schools, and ended up going to the WOSTEP school in Miami, Florida. And we moved from San Francisco to Miami, and kind of abandoned my tech career. It was kind of a scary thing.
Well, it is a scary thing, and you're very fortunate that you have a wife who supported you to do that at the time, because it was a risky chapter in your life, wasn't it? And I read a quote that you likened enrolling in a full-time watchmaking school, and I'm going to quote now, a bit like jumping off the high dive without first learning how to swim, unquote. What did you mean by that?
Because it's a whole new world, and a lot of watchmaking schools, they don't want you to really have any prior experience. They want to be able to teach you their way of working with watches, and it's a whole world that kind of unfolds if you don't really know much about mechanical watches, but you have some mechanical dexterity, aptitude. You feel that you could work with small parts. You end up just learning so much so quick, and to me it was incredible. I knew right away this is something that I always wanted to do. It was both exciting and also pretty scary because I convinced my wife. I said, and she went along with it. She said, let's give up your very stable, very well-paying tech career in San Francisco and move to Miami, where we've never lived before. We don't know anyone, and go to school, and who knows what's going to happen.
What's going to happen? Well, I'm very impressed with both of you.
Thank you.
After school, you moved to New York, and that was in 2013, and immersed yourself in the watchmaking community. Mm-hmm. And you soon became the technical writer for Hodinkee. Mm-hmm. Now, that was the sort of beginning time of Hodinkee, is that right?
Yes. Yep.
And I'm just sort of thinking, that was only 10 years ago, really, but it seems like a million years ago, because at the time, the interest in watchmaking wasn't as acute as it is now. And it was, really Ben Clymer's brilliant vision to start explaining watchmaking, talking about it, creating a community to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, you came along who could technically talk about watchmaking and help people understand that watchmaking is so much more than just a pretty picture of a watch. Mm-hmm. What was it like in those early days? Because you were starting a whole new platform in a way, weren't you, of communication?
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of like where we are right now recording this podcast. So this is kind of like it seems like a co-working environment. There's lots of different companies here in this office space. And Hodinkee was originally in a similar space in Lower Manhattan. I think it was a WeWork.
Oh, right.
I think it was a WeWork, on Varick Street. And this Tourbillion 1000% is kind of what got me in the door at Hodinkee. So I made this, and I had always been following Hodinkee, reading Hodinkee when I was going to watchmaking school. And I emailed I guess, info@hodinkee.com out of the blue saying, hey, I made this 3D printed Tourbillon. Would you guys be interested in covering it, writing a story about it? And they said, sure, why don't you come on down, bring it, we'll take some photos of it. And I went there and I met with Ben and Steve and Ashley and Will. And I think it was just the four of them at the time. I think I was maybe the fifth or sixth person at Hodinkee. And just very small team. And I just got along with them. I thought it was a cool team, and I enjoyed what they're doing. And I said, hey, do you guys need any help? Could I help write some articles for you? And at the time, Ben's focus. Ben is he knows everything about every reference model and every exact version of every dial of every Rolex and the value of each one and the style of each one. And that is exactly what I don't know about. And it's just not really my cup of tea. It doesn't really interest me so much. I'm more interested in the technical aspects of watchmaking. And I said, hey, I could, write some articles from a technical perspective for you. And that's what happened. So I joined them as a technical editor and worked there full time for a few years, and then I kind of went part-time to do the silicon hairspring thing, which I think you want to.
Well, we're going to get to that, but let's talk about this because viewers who are watching on YouTube can see that we have in front of us a rather intriguing looking model, which is actually, as Nick just mentioned, it's actually a tourbillon movement, but it's been enlarged 1,000 times. Is that correct? Hence its name, the Tourbillon 1000. Yep. And one thing that I particularly find interesting is this was printed. This is a 3D printed mechanism. Yep. So can you tell us, how you got interested in 3D printing for watch parts, and then also it would be wonderful to talk about the tourbillon itself. It's probably the most complicated complication that can be found in a watch, and very few watch manufacturers actually make a tourbillon because it is an extremely difficult complication to make. And so I'm intrigued that you come out of watchmaking school and the first thing you do is make a tourbillon, which you just went straight to the hardest thing you could possibly do.
Well, it was difficult to make. It also was easy to make because it was 3D printed. So I always try to be honest with myself, and I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. I guess I know what I'm not good at, and what I was never good at in watchmaking school was micromechanics. So actually making things in the metal, very small parts, grinding and finishing and polishing and burnishing. And so that's kind of why I was attracted to 3D printing, because it takes all of that out of the equation. You just design it on the computer, and you just kind of, for the most part, hit print, and an hour later you have the part in front of you. So
which is amazing, because what I can see, because I'm obviously right next to it, is I always think of printing as a paper, but this is plastic.
Yep.
So you can obviously print in. Can you print in any material?
Pretty much, yeah. These days they have pretty advanced 3D printers. You can print in metal, you can print in wood and carbon fiber. They can't really print small enough to make parts that go into a watch movement.
Right. That's good to know.
They can print cases for watches, but
right.
dials. But the actual parts, they're still
good. We still need human beings.
Yeah.
I'm so pleased to hear that.
Yeah. And it's going to be a while till we get to that point. But
well, first of all, tell us what a tourbillon is.
Yeah, well, tourbillon is a French word. It means whirlwind or whirlpool. And a tourbillon is a device that rotates a balance wheel and an escapement in a watch while it's running. And it's rotating it to compensate for the effects of gravity. And gravity is constantly pulling on the hairspring and the balance wheel and kind of changing the way it runs. Tourbillons in wristwatches are kind of not necessary, because when you wear a wristwatch, you move your wrist all over during the day, so it's always moving in 3 dimensions. But back when most people were wearing pocket watches and you kept them in your pocket, they were kept in a vertical position, and gravity would pull on the hairspring ever so slightly and kind of change the rate. So what a tourbillon does is it equalizes the rate in all different positions, even if the watch is stationary. This is kind of a controversial thing. You can argue it either way. In my opinion, a tourbillon is not a complication, because it doesn't add anything to the dial of the watch. It doesn't add any new information to the dial of the watch. I think of it more as just a mechanism that is inside the watch. But it can be argued either way, and there's no strict definition of it.
Well, that's interesting, because a tourbillon, Patek certainly makes tourbillon watches, and unlike most manufacturers, it does not cut a small hole in the dial so that you can see the cage when you're actually looking at the watch. The only way you'd know that that was a particular watch with a tourbillon movement is it says tourbillon on the dial, and Patek doesn't show it because it feels that, and this is my understanding, that it doesn't want light to come in and affect the oil that's in the tourbillon, or affect its accuracy, and therefore affect its accuracy. Do you agree with that? I mean, it's interesting because you're just saying how it's just another component in a watch, but does it need that much care?
No, I don't quite agree with that.
So there's going to be a lot of people who pay an awful lot of money for a tourbillon that are going to be a bit concerned about that. Yeah. But it's still a fascinating movement, and it was created in 1795 by Breguet. And here we are almost 290 years later, and it's still a movement component that fascinates us. So let's talk a little bit about the escapement, because this hasn't got an escape. Am I correct in understanding that this isn't a typical escapement that you've put in this tourbillon? Could you explain what inspired you to make this particular escapement?
Yeah, this is a special type of coaxial escapement. Do you want it to run? Do you want to hear it for a second?
Yes, I'd love to hear it, because the escapement, just to remind people, is really what makes the tick-tock sound.
The idea with this model is that with my right hand, I'm holding the fourth wheel stationary, and the tourbillon is rotating around the fourth wheel. So it's not a complete watch movement. It's just a tourbillon and the fourth wheel. That's it. But it's kind of the fun, interesting parts. So the escapement is a coaxial escapement. It's the type that George Daniels was famous for. And this specific coaxial escapement is a symmetrical coaxial escapement. It's a variation on the version that Daniels made, but he described it in his book. I don't think he ever made it in a watch. I think maybe he made it added it to a clock at one point. But I wanted to try to make it because it's something a little bit different. And the coaxial escapement it's got certain benefits over a lever escapement and certain drawbacks as well. It doesn't really need lubrication. It's a little bit just functions a little bit better over time, but it is more difficult to manufacture, more difficult to adjust, more difficult to install. So there's some trade-offs there.
Okay, well that's very interesting. You obviously have a passion for escapements, and is this because it's a component that can constantly be improved upon in terms of reliability?
Yeah, because it's the heart of the watch.
And accuracy, because obviously it's the most important part for accuracy, isn't it?
Well, not really accuracy, because even a stopwatch is accurate twice a day.
Oh, right, fair point.
It's precision.
Precision, right.
Because the development of the escapement over centuries is, it's the heart of all watch movements. We don't really know who invented the first escapement. And today we just kind of take it for granted because, we have a smartphone in our pocket that's super precise and uses GPS time from satellites. But when mechanical watches were necessary for daily life, the escapement was a very important technical piece of the puzzle. And they are my favorite part of the mechanical watch. How do you make a mechanical watch even more precise than the verge, than the lever, than the coaxial? You eventually get to a detent escapement. But a detent escapement, it's like I said before, it has advantages and disadvantages, and we've all kind of settled on the lever escapement.
Okay. Well, our last guest was Dr. Peter Fries, who is the director of the Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva. And he was telling us a story about how he had 10 different tourbillons in front of him. One day they'd taken them out of their cases, the movements out of the case. And there was a couple of Breguets as well as Patek. Yep. And some of them had detente escapements, and those were his favorite because he was explaining how, just as we heard when you made this escapement work, it goes tick-tock, tick-tock, and then a detente goes tick-tick, tick-tick, and that's the sound that he really loves to listen to. So that there's a lot more behind just a different type of escapement, isn't there? Yeah. What's in your opinion, is the most important component in horological history in watchmaking?
I think it's tied between the escapement and the hairspring.
The hairspring.
Yeah.
Well, the hairspring, that's interesting because that brings us very nicely on to the next part, which I want to talk to you about, which is you started Firehouse Horology, and that's a company that manufactures silicon components for the watchmaking industry. And the first thing that you manufactured was a balance spring. Is that correct?
Yep.
And I just really want to emphasize to people that is one of the hardest components you can possibly make in watchmaking. And when I started at Patek Philippe, for example, and used to take people around the workshops, I would explain that Patek tries to make as much of the watch as it possibly can itself. So not only the case, but also obviously the movement. But there were two things that Patek could not make. One was the sapphire crystal that goes over the dial, because that is a very specialist operation, demands a huge manufacturing facility. And the other is the hairspring, because it is such a specialist and difficult task to create. And really, there's only a few specialist manufacturers in the world. Most of them are in Switzerland, fewer in Japan and Germany. And here you are in America
Yeah, which was
So you just wanted to make things really hard for yourself, obviously.
that was an issue that we were here in America doing it. So I started the company with my friend Kieran Shaker in, I think it was 2015, I think. And we decided right away we wanted to start with the most difficult part we could possibly.
Why? Why would you decide to do that? Why would you go straight out and make the hardest thing possible?
It was for a reason that the American watchmaking industry doesn't get a lot of attention these days. And we thought if we started with the most difficult part to manufacture, it would bring a little bit more credibility to actually doing real manufacturing here in the U.S. So that's why we started with the silicon hairspring.
That's amazing. That really is amazing. So was it hard to convince manufacturers to buy your components?
Yes, it was practically impossible. And that's why we closed the business.
Oh, you closed it. Oh, it makes me so sad to hear that.
Yes.
And it sort of reminded me of obviously one of your great inspirations was George Daniels, the genius watchmaker who you referred to earlier for his coaxial escapement that inspired the escapement that you made for the Tourbillon 1000. Mm-hmm. And it took him many, many years to sell the coaxial escapement to a Swiss watchmaker because they couldn't get their head around it, and they couldn't believe that this man in England could come up with this incredible invention. And so I am so sorry to hear that, because that was a valiant try.
Yeah,
it really was.
It's I learned a lot from it, and I'm open about it. You know, we were not successful with the business, and we decided to close it down right before COVID. But it was, a good 5 years of full-time R&D in a nanofabrication clean room up at Columbia University, building these hairsprings, and we had them tested by Francois Paul Jorn to kind of have a third-party test to verify them, and they were working great. So we made a product that was working. It was was ready to go, but we didn't really think about how were we going to sell these things.
Right.
And when it came down to it, there was no one in the U.S. that was really making watches at the level where they would need to purchase hairsprings. That's different today, but back then there was no one, and so we thought, okay, we need to go to Switzerland. So we went to Switzerland and we tried our best to sell the hairsprings, and it was just very, very difficult to sell. It was impossible. We were not successful in selling American hairsprings to Swiss brands, and that's not surprising. You want a watch that's Swiss made. You don't want it to be Swiss and American made. So it didn't work out. I look back at it with fond memory.
Well, you should be very proud of what you did. And I mean, our listeners will be familiar with Patek Philippe's advanced research, and they actually also invested a lot in silicon technology, and they patented the Spiromax balance wheel, which is made of Silonvar, and that was in 2006, and that was a revolution in itself. That here was this bastion of watchmaker, Patek Philippe, going into this absolutely specialist area with this unusual material.
Yep.
And so I can see you were up against a lot of not competition, but some walls I'm sure were put up, because it's such especially the balance spring industry is such an established industry amongst very few companies, isn't it? They have a bit of a monopoly over the whole thing. Yeah. I would think.
We were just two guys here in New York, a small startup, and it was not really possible to battle the big players.
I love your courage and your valiant try to do so. You should be highly commended for that.
Thank you.
Obviously you're experimenting with the new materials, silicon. And one of the wonderful things about watchmaking is that technically it's always progressing because of that ultimate goal, and you mentioned it earlier, precision. Can you think of any new materials that might start coming in? I mean, it was much of a shock to put silicon in a watch, but can you think of any other materials, or have they maybe not even been invented yet?
I can't think of any new materials, but I can tell you that my opinions around silicon have changed. I used to be a big proponent of it. I used to think this is the future of watchmaking. Everyone is going to want to have a silicon spring in their watch. They're going to want to have escape wheels made from silicon. Now I've kind of changed my mind about it.
So why? Tell us, why have you changed your mind?
Because the part of the big appeal of a mechanical watch is the traditional aspect of it. And silicon just is the opposite of that. I did not agree. There was a lot of arguments against silicon because people would say, well, what happens when your watchmaker needs to replace a broken silicon part? They can never manufacture a new one. You could manufacture a new one. I mean, we were manufacturing hairsprings from scratch. You could absolutely manufacture a replacement silicon hairspring, a replacement silicon escape wheel. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not a cheap thing to do, but it's possible to do. So I didn't really buy that argument, but my thought now is more that mechanical watches they're not necessary today. We don't need them for everyday life, but we enjoy them, we collect them. There's a massive worldwide industry devoted to them. And why is that? It's because I think we enjoy some of the traditional aspects of them. You can't really find that with silicon parts.
Interesting. Well, obviously here at Collectability, we're all about vintage Patek Philippe watches, and we embrace the past very much. So that's interesting that you say that, because we tend to agree with you there. But talking about collecting, do you collect watches or pocket watches?
Not really. I mean, I've got a small collection. Pocket watches, like you mentioned. I've got a small collection of wristwatches, a little bit bigger collection of pocket watches. I really enjoy American pocket watches, railroad watches in particular. And I guess I enjoy American wristwatches. I'm wearing the Bulova Accutron today.
That's very smart.
Tuning fork watch. I enjoy American horology in general. I really appreciate it. It's there's a lot of stories to tell in American horology. And today, most of the focus, rightly so, is on Switzerland. But there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of history, a lot of innovation that happened here in the U.S.
Well, I think that for a lot of people who are new to the world of watchmaking, there might not be an appreciation of how huge the American watch industry was, particularly at the turn of the century. And one of the reasons is the railroad watch that you just mentioned. Could you explain that? What you mean when you say railroad watch?
A railroad watch is a type of watch that's been certified for use on a railroad. Back the late 1800s, early 1900s, the railroad was expanding across the U.S. and the U.S. was growing. Rail travel was becoming easy and quick and cheap. There were a series of really bad train accidents where trains were colliding, crashing into each other. People were dying, and they found it was because the conductors on the trains had their watches set to different times. So there's these parts of the train tracks where maybe they intersect or they need to time where they're going to be, and their timing was just off. And so this is kind of one of the main reasons why we decided to implement time zones, and it's this was the reason why we decided that we needed to have a certification for the types of watches that conductors used on railroads. So it's just a watch that is built a little bit sturdier, nicer, more precise, and I guess the one specific thing with a railroad watch that's different than other watches is to change the time, you needed to remove the crystal from the front of the watch and flip a lever up, and then change it with the crown. So you had to be very deliberate about changing the time. It wasn't something that you could accidentally change while it was in your pocket or just touch.
So it's a security measure.
Security measure, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when was this?
Turn of the century.
Turn of the century.
Yes.
So, and am I right in assuming that these railroad watches were in a way the envy of the entire watchmaking industry worldwide because of their accuracy?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And they were very much, and they were copied.
Yes,
by the Swiss.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, and it's kind of the same thing today where we look at pilots' watches or dive watches, and they're popular and people think they're very cool and they want to collect them because it represented something. It represented a watch that was a higher quality that people in a certain job would use to to complete their job, and it was a desirable watch for people. So railroad watches quickly became kind of a marketing thing, where the American brands and brands around the world would say this is a railroad watch. Maybe it's not a official certified railroad watch, but they could just advertise it as such, or put a railroad on the packaging, just like today how we put a fighter jet on the packaging.
Right.
And it's a pilot.
It's a pilot watch,
Yeah.
right? Yes. As we wrap up this first part of our conversation, brings me to a very important question to ask you, Nick, which is, will there ever be a thriving American watch industry again?
Yes and no.
Well, Nick, thank you. I'm going to actually stop you before you answer this important question, because I'd like to leave that to part 2 of our conversation. And so for now, we're going to wrap up this part of the conversation with Nicholas Manousos. And I want to thank you all for listening and encourage you to listen to part 2, which will be coming out next week. And in the meantime, thank you. Thank you, Nick. And thank you all for listening. And if you liked this episode, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss any future podcasts. This is Tania Edwards for Collectability.